Can we start with the when you became leader of the Labour Party and the legacy of the 1992 election defeat, and in particular the shadow budget proposals, the idea that you would increase tax to increase benefits, which, as it were, provided a context against which you were needing to think about then both your electoral strategy but also the sort of governing ideas of the New Labour project. How did those things sort of shape your approach to thinking about welfare and pensions in the period in the run-up to becoming Prime Minister?
Before we won the 1997 election, and because we'd lost 4 elections in a row, we'd been out of power for virtually 2 decades. So we were extremely cautious at that point, for political reasons, of doing anything that suggested we were going to raise people's taxes. I mean, the Labour Party had a history of being seen as a high tax party. The 1992 shadow budget had been a presentational success, but politically, frankly, difficult. And, I learned 2 lessons out of that. One, which is, don't hand your opponents an easy object to attack. And secondly, kind of the absurdity, because in the end, the entirety of that shadow budget was £3.6 billion, which nowadays I know is a kind of rounding error in the government accounts. But at that point, politically, assumed dramatic proportions in the context of the 1992 election campaign. So, for those political reasons, I was really focused on the politics of it. I was determined not to end up with large-scale welfare commitments that ended up with large-scale taxation commitments.
And then coming to office in your first term then, the focus was on means testing, using tax credits and other measures to lift the poorest out of poverty. But can you say what it was that then changed in the environment in your first to second terms about pensions that made you think actually this needs a different approach?
Well, one of the things about government is that you come into power, and it's the most extraordinary thing, politics, really. Because only in politics would you put people in positions of huge responsibility with no discernible qualifications, because you win the election, which is a qualification as a politician, but it's not a qualification as an executive, right? And what you realize when you become you leave opposition and come into government is that the skill set that you require to win is completely different from the skill set you require to govern. Skill set of winning is being a great persuader. The skill set of governing is to be a great executive. And so in the first term, we were still dealing with things in quite a political way. I mean, a lot of people think, my first term was the radical term, and then second term got overshadowed by foreign policy post 9/11 and so on. But actually, we were a much better government in the second term in terms of our ability to seize issues in a deep way and start to make proper far-reaching change. So in our first term, we were concerned about pensioner poverty, which is a huge issue, and we wanted to deal with it. We had difficulties, revolt over a very small prices-related rise of the state pension causes a big difficulty early in government. So it was much more a kind of tactical approach, frankly, on pensions at that point. It was only in the second term that I started to grapple with some of the long-term big problems that needed to be resolved around education, healthcare, criminal justice reform, and pensions and welfare.
How does pensions come to occupy its place alongside things which had always been your priority, like education, albeit that you were taking a different approach? What made it kind of one of your top rank issues domestically?
I think I felt in the second term, particularly again with a very large majority, that we had a real obligation to try and tackle some of the long-term problems. Now, one of those was how were universities going to be funded in circumstances where it was increasingly obvious that if we utilised them in the right way, universities would become actually a major engine of the economy and not just a place of learning for people. So that was what pushed us towards a more radical approach on higher education. And then in relation to pensions, it was obvious that the numbers of people who were relying on state pension was rising. Your traditional defined benefit pensions were declining, and then people were living longer, more healthily, and the younger generation was going to have to start paying more and more for the older generation. So there were obvious challenges in pensions around cost and sustainability.
You decided at that point to set up the Turner Commission, Adair Turner and two others, John Hills and Jeannie Drake. That isn't a sort of standard royal commission. And I just wonder if you'd say a little bit about that, because there is a perception in the literature that royal commissions had their day. Was there a sort of conscious decision then to say, actually, look, let's not create a big royal commission, let's do something much more focused?
Yes, absolutely. We decided to do this in a different way based on experience. The trouble with royal commissions, they have this grand title and these quite large commissions, and they just ended up with the lowest common denominator policy. So I was really determined on this to choose, one high quality leader of it, and then we added in time two other actually very high quality people, one from the more academic side was John Hills, and then Jeannie Drake from the trade union side, but people who were sensible people, because it's like anything else in life, the quality of what you produce depends on the quality of the people producing it. And, to do this in a way where I had someone of sufficient intellectual weight and rigor, flanked by two others likewise, that were going to produce an answer. And I said to them all the way through, leave me to handle the politics. I'll handle the politics. What I want to know from you is what's right. And we had done something a little similar, not quite the same, with the Low Pay Commission and the minimum wage. I mean, we never had a minimum wage in the UK. People have been trying for 100 years. It was a fierce bone of contention politically between business and the Conservatives on the one side and trade unions and Labour on the other. But, I knew if it was going to settle down as a reform, it had to be done in a way that the methodology of reform and almost the psychology of it had to be right. So the Low Pay Commission brought business and the unions together. It was a moderate and clearly, grounded in reality type of exercise. And the result of it is that the minimum wage then became part of the architecture. So I was influenced both by what I regard as not a great outcome on the Social Care Commission and what was a good outcome on the Low Pay Commission. And I wanted, in this instance, to have a commission that was small and tight and was clearly going to do great work.
Let's move then to what happens when the Turner Commission starts to produce analysis and evidence and arguments. I just want to ask you a little bit about your ways of working as a Prime Minister, because this isn't something which is on the sort of delivery side. It's not a kind of Michael Barber stocktake process. It's not a drilling down into how a department is implementing an agreed policy. It's about a very, very complex and challenging area of policy where a new framework needs to be agreed. How do you go about giving yourself the time in what's a very busy, packed prime ministerial schedule to kind of address yourself to that, to kind of giving the political leadership that's needed?
One of the reasons I do what I do now with my institute, which focuses a lot on questions of how do you equip leaders for today's world, and focuses on issues to do with governance. And making policy is a fascinating example of how you have to have the right process in and around the leader to try and do that. Now, what does that mean? It means, first of all, that the leader has got to have sufficient time to think strategically and to realize that politics is at a certain level a very intellectual business, and people constantly misunderstand this. They just think it's about political instinct and political decisions. No, it's actually, some of these problems are very complicated problems, much more complicated than you get in your average private sector organization. And it requires a deep level of engagement combined with very thorough policy analysis to get anywhere near the right answer when you're dealing with problems that require a change in framework, so that you're altering the given parameters of a particular policy area and you're going beyond those or changing them. So this is, over time, again, I realized I had to have a way of working that gave me time to really go into these issues in sufficient depth that at least I understood what the the essential elements were, and then could give guidance to the people that were advising me on policy as to how far we could go or how broad and challenging we could be. But all the way through, I've always thought if it's clear that your answer is properly grounded in a good analysis and a proper process of policy making, you're likely to get it through politically.
Something that each of those that we've interviewed have said is that it was because the Turner Commission's costings could not be challenged, that they were watertight, that you were able to make then the political argument for the reforms that were being proposed.
Yeah, no, the benefit of the analysis that Adair and his colleagues did was that I was able to say, okay, but if you got a better answer, then let's hear it. But you can't ignore this problem, and it's a very clear and an obvious problem that's, by the way, going on all over the developed world. So, we have to deal with it, and that their remit. I was a little. Because there was some disagreements with the Treasury as to how the remit should be drawn up and so on. I was always encouraging them to just give us the answers and let's have a look at it.
So just in terms of the run-up to White Paper in 2006, the Turner Commission had done its final report. Would you be spending 2, 3, 4 hours a week in meetings on this? What was amongst your key priorities at that time? Can you remember?
Yeah, no, I think I was spending a lot of time on it, maybe even 5 or 6 hours in a week in the run-up to it. Because, it was such an important thing. And this is, when you're putting in place something like this is going to last a long time or not. It's a hard thing to explain to people because, frankly, you have to put a cold towel on your head to get in the difference between the basic pension and the defined benefit and defined contributions and state second pension and blah, etc. It's not easy stuff, but you've got to get a sufficient understanding so that you can grasp the politics and work out how to present it. But also, with something like this, you've got to be reasonably sure you're getting it right.
One of the things that people often say about these reforms is it requires some concession from everybody. Can you just say a little bit about wider reform processes where those stakeholders and where the wider public has to be convinced of what is quite a big set of proposals?
I think when you're doing something like pensions reform or any reform that's got big implications for people and is going to affect their lives, this is something they will notice. Okay. The methodology of reform is incredibly important. How you set it up, the credibility of the setup, the credibility of the analysis that describes the problem, and then the credibility of the solution. And all of that depends on, I think, people recognizing, one, that it's driven by evidence and not by ideology. Two, that if there's pain fairly spread, and if there's gain is fairly spread. And three, what all of that means is that you try and bring the different parts of the debate together. But we very deliberately decided that it all had to begin with an analysis that was published and that was going to be pretty undefeatable as a piece of work. Because the thing I always find with people is if you actually explain to them that really is a problem, they will come round to it. So raising the basic pension age at which you could receive it, it's one of these things when you first suggest it to people, they're against it because they think you're just taking money away, and I've made my contributions on this basis. And why? They're going to be against it. Why would you be in favour of it? But once you explain the evidence to people, and some of what we did with the Department of Work and Pensions was to do sort of almost like citizens' jury type of engagement. Once you explain it to people, they understand. And part of the problem in politics today is you need the space to be able to convince people of long-term reform, and you need to engage with people in a way that forces them to realize that politicians are dealing with difficult decisions in which you can't please everybody, and you're going to have to make difficult choices. And frankly, if the politicians aren't making difficult choices, then they're not really governing in the way they have a duty to govern. And if the public doesn't understand the need for difficult choices, that allows a whole populist type of politics to exploit this and try and tell people there's some simple solution to their problems when usually there isn't. And pensions is a classic example. There's no simple solution to it. If you're going to provide for people in their old age, you're going to have to find a way of the taxpayer contributing to that people think is fair, generationally fair between different groups of pensioners, fair in the sense of meeting the needs of people who may, for reasons that are completely beyond their control, become destitute or fall on hard times, and at the same time making sure people have a sense of personal responsibility to provide for their own future rather than simply leaving it to the general body of taxpayers. So these are difficult things that are never going to be easy to resolve, and therefore how you do it and the methodology and almost the psychology of reform becomes extremely important.
One of the arguments made here is that partly the nature of the issue, that you're addressing something in the long term and you can then have a decent run up to it, so it's appropriate that you have a commission and then a process of reform and then implementation which takes place over a number of different governments. And partly also the argument that you give Turner time, you're not trying to do this, they can run for a couple of years, produce the analysis, that seems to be important here too.
Yes, definitely.
And then the other is, it has been argued that the public were prepared to accept reforms and indeed sort of soft compulsion into saving more in their pensions, even actually in a period after a financial crisis when these reforms start coming in and their wages are stagnant, they're still accepting the reforms on the basis that they think that everybody can agree that you need a decent pension in retirement, and actually they're prepared to accept that their responsibilities to save are meaningful ones, whereas in some other areas of policy they don't accept it's legitimate for the state to ask them to do things. So is that your sense of it?
That is my sense of it. And it's also that people, they're well aware of the fact that people are living longer, living more healthy lives for a longer period. I don't think most people of my generation and below, certainly below, do not, I think, view retirement in the way that my father's generation or my mother's generation viewed it. The world's just changed. It's no great news, but the change is a very profound one in the sense that, when after the war and pension provision was in existence at that time, people could expect to work until a certain age. At that age, stop working, go into retirement, and they would, have a few years, frankly, before they passed away. Okay. Today, I don't think people look at their lives in that way at all. They don't look at their working lives in the same way. They don't look at the concept of retirement. Lots of people would expect to be doing something well into their late 60s, early 70s, and maybe beyond that, if they can. Which is why I think, in the end, when it comes to something like social care, there's going to have to be at some point a massive rethink of that and how it works. And all of these things are going to change pretty radically again at a certain point. But in relation to pensions, I think establishing that we just had to come to terms with that modern reality was probably the single biggest thing that the Pension Commission did.
Just on this point about the sort of sense of a change in the electorate, 2017, your age was a better predictor of how you voted than your social class. And that change had been building up over some time. Were you conscious of a kind of emerging age divide in politics at all at this time? Did this feature in your thinking? Or was it simply that you were conscious of this demographic change and that was the most important thing to prepare for, rather than, say, a block of older voters who might have a certain view of any reforms you might propose?
Well, I think we were always aware that, the older voters were a growing number, and I always used to say to people that interactions with pensioners on any subject didn't always lead you to the conclusion that people got more mellow with their old age. They could be pretty hardcore, actually. But no, what I think did start to come home to me more was the gap between the people who felt the changing world, globalization, multicultural society, technology becoming a major part of our lives, the people who were comfortable with that world and the people who were not comfortable. Now, the people who are not comfortable tended to be older. Not always, by the way, at all, but tended to be older. The people who are comfortable with that world tended to be younger. That's the change I noticed. But I think, to be honest, with these, we're talking about, pre-financial crash and pre-Brexit and all of that, I think it was really the cost question that was pushing me. Because I didn't want to be in a situation where we weren't dealing with long-term questions, and I wanted to make sure that we were putting in place sustainable reforms that would basically be, whether it was in the field of devolution, pensions, welfare, whatever it was, that would last for the long term.
How you now think about pensions reform in the kind of key priorities of your final term and a half of office? Where do you rank this as in terms of your achievements?
I always thought that pensions reform was the thing that we did really well, but most people don't even remember. But the test of reforms is always, do they get rid of them or not? And pensions reform obviously has been built on, but it's the essential framework remains in place. Now, pensions reform, I think, is one of the things that we did in the right way and pretty much with the right result. And I think it does give you quite a good clue as to how you do these future reforms. And I think one of the big challenges for government now and going forward is going to be, how do you redraw tax and spending? How do you modernize your taxation system and modernize the distribution of your spending, as well as simply the amount of it? What are you spending on and for what purpose? What are you taxing and to what end? I think these are big, big questions. And I think the pensions reform that we did gives something of a clue as to how you might approach these things. And I think if I was back in government today, I would be doing a lot on this. And we tried in 2005 to do this fundamental savings review. It never really worked because there was too much disagreement in government over it. But I think if you were back in government today, you would be doing something that really is very fundamental about the future of the welfare state and how it operates. And the pensions, the methodology and psychology of the pensions reform is not a bad guide.